Look, I need you to set aside the noise on social media for a second and listen to the actual text of what was just agreed to. Because what we're seeing unfold right now in the Persian Gulf isn't just a ceasefire. It's a fundamental restructuring of who controls global trade, who gets to build a nuclear arsenal, and who gets paid for the privilege. The White House is telling you this is the golden age of the Middle East. They're telling you Iran blinked. But here's the thing. When you actually read the 10 points of this agreement, and we're going to go through them line by line today, this doesn't look like the art of the deal. This looks like the art of the surrender. And the person cashing the checks isn't the American taxpayer, it's the Ayatollah. All right, let's rewind the tape to Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. That was the self-imposed deadline set by the administration. Missiles were in the air just days prior. We were, frankly, on the brink of a full-scale regional war after the exchange of strikes in the Strait. And then suddenly the phone lines lit up. We got a ceasefire, 2 weeks of no shooting. Here's the basic timeline of what went down. President Trump gets on the phone with the AFP news agency and declares, quote, total and complete victory, 100%. He says the uranium stockpile is going to be perfectly taken care of. He then jumps on Truth Social and paints this picture of American ships just hanging around, making sure everything is cool and that big money will be made. But simultaneously, over in Tehran, state media wasn't talking about surrendering. They were publishing a 10-point framework. And here's where the story gets interesting and frankly a little concerning. Because the White House version and the Iranian version of this deal, they're not the same document. One side is talking about a victory parade. The other side is talking about collecting rent on the world's most important waterway. So why are we here? Why did we have a war? And why does this specific ceasefire look so one-sided on paper? We need to go back to the status quo before the recent escalation. Before the airstrikes started, let's call it early 2026, the United States maintained a policy of maximum pressure, remnants of the previous Trump era and Biden era sanctions. Iran was economically strangled. They were enriching uranium, yes, but they were doing so under the threat of snapback sanctions and without official international consent for a full weapons program. Crucially, the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain ensured freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran didn't control the shipping lanes. They harassed them. They seized tankers occasionally, but they didn't own them. And they certainly weren't legally allowed to charge a toll. Now, fast forward to the 2 weeks of conflict. We saw the exchange of fire, and during those talks, Iran laid out a 10-point plan. We've obtained the details of this plan from regional news outlets and cross-referenced them with the International Atomic Energy Agency's public statements. The key players here are obviously President Trump and Supreme Leader Khamenei. But we also have to watch Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is reportedly extremely uncomfortable with the enrichment clauses, and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who sees a cash flush Iran as a direct security threat. Let's start with the money, because this is where the rubber meets the road, literally. The Strait of Hormuz sees about 130 ships a day. That's roughly 50,000 ships a year, carrying about 20% of the world's oil. President Trump says the U.S. Navy is going in there to help with traffic buildup, but that is not in the plan Iran agreed to. Here's the original analysis you won't hear on cable news. If Iran is charging $2 million per transit, which they've indicated they will split with Oman, this isn't a security arrangement, this is a business transaction. And it's a transaction that shifts the burden of global energy security from the U.S. taxpayer to the global consumer, with the profit going directly to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Think about the math. Iran's entire GDP is around $400 to $450 billion. This one toll system could represent a 20 to 25% increase in their national income annually. That is not a defeat. That is a stimulus package paid for by the world's oil tankers. And who is going to stop them? The United States just agreed in point 9 to withdraw combat forces from the region. Now let's talk about the uranium. President Trump said the stockpile would be perfectly taken care of. I want to be very clear about what the text says versus what the spin is. Point 3 of the agreement is the acceptance of Iran's uranium enrichment. It does not say suspension. It does not say monitored reduction. It says acceptance. This is the formal international legitimization of Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. For years, U.S. policy, both Democrat and Republican, was not one centrifuge spinning. That red line has been not just crossed, but erased entirely. Here's my original take. This is the most significant nuclear proliferation shift since the JCPOA was torn up in 2018. We've gone from trying to contain the program to conceding the program. And the justification we're hearing from pro-Trump media, they're saying this is somehow a win because it prevents a wider war right now. But that's the classic North Korea dilemma. You buy short-term peace by funding and legitimizing a long-term nuclear threat. And by the way, points 4 and 5 lift all primary and secondary sanctions. That means the cash faucet for this nuclear program just got turned back on at full blast. Finally, we need to look at how this is being sold to the American public versus what's happening on the ground. We pulled clips from the usual cable news suspects, and it's a masterclass in expectation management. Commentators are calling this a Henry V moment. They're talking about crazy like a Fox strategy. They claim Iran blinked. But again, look at the streets of Tehran. We're seeing videos of celebration. They aren't celebrating because they lost the Strait of Hormuz. They're celebrating because they just won the right to tax it. This is where the media literacy gap becomes a national security issue. If the American public is told this is a victory, they won't understand why oil prices remain volatile or why Israel might decide to act unilaterally in 6 months. They won't understand why we just traded our naval presence for a traffic advisor role. The reaction has been swift and it's breaking along predictable lines, but with some interesting cracks. On the right, you have the full-throated defense. As we saw, figures like Mark Levin are trying to pivot to the idea of arming the Iranian people for a future regime change, which is ironic given that we just handed the current regime $100 billion a year in toll revenue. But there are quiet concerns coming from the more hawkish corners of the GOP. People are asking what happened to the maximum pressure campaign. The Wall Street Journal's editorial page, usually a cheerleader for the administration, ran a piece asking if this was the outcome we really wanted regarding the nuclear file. On the international stage, Israel is the elephant in the room. Prime Minister Netanyahu is reportedly looking for carve-outs, arguing that the ceasefire doesn't apply to Hezbollah in Lebanon or proxies in Yemen. He's trying to keep the war hot on the periphery because he knows that a cash-flush nuclear threshold Iran is an existential problem that this deal doesn't solve. And then there are the markets. While the immediate ceasefire calmed oil futures slightly, analysts are now pricing in the Hormuz risk premium. That's a fancy way of saying shipping insurance is about to skyrocket because no one knows if Iran will honor the 10 to 15 ship limit or if this is just the new cost of doing business. So let's bring it down to earth. What does this actually mean for you? The person watching this video who just wants to know if they can afford a summer road trip or what this means for the troops? First, the economic ripple effect. That $2 million toll gets passed down. It's not just the oil companies paying, it's the price at the pump, the cost of imported goods, and the potential for inflation to spike again if this ceasefire collapses and we get a real blockade. Second, the 2-week clock. This is a ceasefire, not a treaty. The clock is ticking. April 22nd, that's the drop-dead date. We are on notice that in 2 weeks we either have a permanent agreement that solidifies these points or we're right back to shooting, but with Iran in a much stronger financial and strategic position. Third, Israel's next move. Watch the skies over Syria and Lebanon. If Israel sees the writing on the wall that the United States has accepted Iran's nuclear status, they may feel compelled to act unilaterally before that program is fully weaponized. That is the wild card that could blow this whole golden age up overnight. Now, I want to take a moment here because it's important for this channel's credibility. I know what supporters of this deal are going to say. They're going to say, look, Ben, you're missing the forest for the trees. War is hell. We were dropping bombs. There were American and Iranian casualties. If buying a 2-week ceasefire stops the body bags, maybe that's the art of the deal in 2026. Maybe this is just a cooling off period to get a better deal later. And listen, the goal of stopping the killing is always a worthy one. I'm not rooting for war, but here's the counterpoint. There's a difference between a tactical pause and a strategic retreat. By codifying Iran's right to enrichment and control of the strait in writing, you've moved the goalpost permanently. It's very hard to unring that bell. You can't walk back acceptance of enrichment in 2 weeks when you already put it on paper. So here's the key takeaway. We are witnessing a fundamental pivot in American foreign policy in real time. It's a pivot away from global policing and towards something that looks a lot like paying protection money. The question I want you to answer down in the comments is this: is this the golden age of the Middle East, or is it the dawn of a new era of Iranian dominance in the Gulf? I want to know where you stand. And more importantly, let's see what happens on April 22nd. Hit that like button if you want us to do a follow-up video the day that ceasefire expires. Subscribe if you're new, and I promise to keep you updated without the spin and without the state media talking points. We're just looking at the receipts. I'll see you in the next one.